Hi class, this is your instructor Cindy Singleton, your instructor for EAD 530. This is a presentation covering a brief history of learning outcomes assessment. Now you'll hear some terminology, see some acronyms in this presentation, but I certainly don't expect you to remember them. You won't be tested, but I think it's helpful to have a background of how our education system has evolved over the last 100 years. Some of you may have heard of John Dewey, pictured here. He's known as an American philosopher, psychologist, and an educational reformer. I particularly like this quote: "If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow." I think that quote is a favorite of mine. It's particularly profound, and it's telling a little bit on what has occurred with our educational system. And if you look at the time of his birth, 1859, and his death in 1952, he was probably somewhat of a progressive thinker in terms of education. He's written several quotes, so I encourage you, if you like quotes, to Google, and you might find a few that you like too. We begin our timeline in 1900, and so from 1900 to 1930, there was a focus on standards. It was focused on standardized testing. This includes multiple choice, matching, true-false, and fill-in-the-blank. We've all seen these and taken these assessments in our lifetime, and they do have their place, but they don't actually measure the quality of a student's learning. One gentleman who was particularly passionate about student learning is Andrew Carnegie, and in 1905 he founded the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. I pulled this quote off their website, off of the About Us page, which explains what they do. "We join together scholars, practitioners, and designers in new ways to solve problems of educational practice." If you haven't done so already, I invite you to visit that website. They have a lot of tools, historical information about education. They have blogs, all kinds of great stuff for educators. I hope you like old photos. You'll see here on the lower left, Andrew Carnegie is seated, and he's in the front row there in the middle. The next photo over is the original Carnegie Foundation. In the third photo over, you see Carnegie on the far left, and next to him is his wife. The Carnegie Foundation also played a role in establishing financial aid for students and also grant programs. The first president of the Carnegie Foundation was Henry Pritchett. He was the president from 1906 to 1930, and his goal was to strengthen teaching and improve learning in higher ed. So he eventually moves on, passes away, but before that there was a second and then a third president, Walter A. Jessup, who became the foundation's president in 1934. He continued the work of Henry Pritchett, and he focused on three themes of that work: the standards of achievement, methods of measuring, and a flexible education, which basically accommodates an individual student's needs and learning styles. In 1928, the Pennsylvania study was completed. This was a 12-hour comprehensive assessment. Imagine being a student sitting at a desk for 12 hours. Well, many did it. For example, 70% of Pennsylvania college seniors completed this assessment. That's 4,580 students. Additionally, 75% of the high school seniors completed that assessment. They totaled 26,500. This assessment, of course, focused on student learning, and it really laid the groundwork for undergraduate achievement and their focus on learning. And then in 1933 to 1947, higher education across the entire U.S. continued to develop, and there was a focus on the whole student at that time. So they focused not just on student test results, but they focused on the students' personality, their social makeup, and their morality. In 1949, we saw a shift from testing of content to testing of reasoning. And the tool they used, the assessment tool, was called the Graduate Record of Examination Aptitude Test. 5 years later, in 1954, there was yet another shift from these reasoning tests to area tests. And the area tests focused on reading comprehension and interpretation. And then another 5 years later, in 1959, the American College Testing Program was established. This is the ACT test many of us have heard of, and it's used as college entrance exams to this day. By the 1970s, we saw yet another shift in instruction, and they began practicing what we know as outcomes-based education. And the federal and state governments, they also began to take notice and focus on a higher quality of education, and that trend continued into the 1980s. This graphic here shows the 3 pillars of outcome-based education. The first pillar here on curriculum, it says that they focus on curriculum that outlines specific, measurable outcomes. And the method of curriculum design and teaching focuses on what students can actually do after they are taught. And that it's not what the lecturer is teaching that's important, but what the outcome is of that teaching. That's what's important. Again, what is the student going to be able to do after that learning? In 1983, President Reagan founded the National Commission on Excellence in Education. That group did a study, produced a report called A Nation at Risk, and that report is considered a great milestone in the history of American education, and it led to school reform throughout the country. One program, No Child Left Behind, is a result of this movement. In 2006, the current Secretary of Education at the time, Margaret Spellings, she commissioned a report called the Spellings Report, and this report focused on the critical thinking, problem solving, and communication in higher ed. In 2013, a gentleman, Pawlyshin, had this to say about the Spellings Report. He writes, despite a movement promoting outcomes assessment for 20-plus years, institutions of higher education were still struggling to attain this emerging standard. This report directed higher education accreditation bodies to require institutions to conduct learning outcomes assessment. And speaking of accreditation, City University of Seattle, I know, is accredited by 3 different accreditors. The first being the Northwest Commission on Colleges and Universities. The next one, Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs. And the third, Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology. There might be more, but I know of these 3. I was able to participate a little bit in the process when CityU was being accredited, and it is quite a rigorous process where the universities produce a lot of data on their programs, their course curriculum, their faculty, their staff, and any institution receiving the accreditation, I believe, is very well deserved. Also in 2006, the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity paired up with the United States Department of Education, and they really put their attention on these accrediting bodies. Also, the Educational Testing Service published the Culture of Evidence, and this was a document report that helped them push different systems to measure assessment. And some institutions were fearing of losing their autonomy. They feared overregulation, and they feared that they were losing control. And one way they defended themselves was to produce their grades of their students, their test scores, and also their graduation rates. And while this data was well and good, they could provide the right kind of evidence to demonstrate the quality of the learning that students were receiving. Today, the focus continues to be on teaching and learning, and faculty are taking responsibility for their ability to teach and for student learning. And while some may not have fully embraced that assessment piece, it's because there might be a little bit of fear there that a poor assessment might make them look like a poor instructor. But here's the solution. Faculty can use this assessment data to their advantage. They can do some self-reflection. They can reflect on their own teaching practices and use that to improve their ability to teach. They can improve their programs and ensure that learning materials are current and that they're relevant. As I wrap up this presentation, I just want to remind you, as we go through this course, that assessments are much more than grades, the grades that one gets on a quiz or a midterm or a final or on a paper. And that good assessments, they tell us what a student learns, and it tells us how a student learns. And as this presentation demonstrates, we've seen over the years a real cultural shift in education, and how education has adopted assessment to improve instruction and improve programs. But keep in mind that ultimately the goal of any assessment is to prepare students for success. So if you have any questions about this presentation or in this course, be sure to post those in the Q&A forum, in the discussion board. Of course, if it's more of a confidential nature, you can certainly send me a private email. I'll leave you with one last thought, and that's to take a peek here at the references. These are all the references I used to create this presentation. Feel free to visit these websites or to use them as you complete research in future papers, whether it's in this course or future courses. And thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you in class.